The Galactic Council made exactly one mistake in their request to humanity for military advisors. They forgot to specify which military advisors they wanted. This oversight would prove to be either the greatest diplomatic accident in galactic history or the most brilliant thing that ever happened to the Council's defense initiative. The jury was still out, mostly because the jury had gotten drunk with the advisors and were now 3 hours into an argument about whether hover tanks counted as real tanks. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Council's request arrived on a Tuesday morning at the United Nations Extraterrestrial Affairs Office, which was actually just a repurposed broom closet on the 3rd floor, with a desk, a coffee maker that had achieved sentience sometime in 2031, and a very tired diplomat named Patricia Holbrook, who had stopped questioning her life choices around the same time the coffee maker started making passive-aggressive comments about her outfit selections. The message itself was transmitted through what the aliens called a quantum fold communicator, which translated roughly into a really expensive fax machine that worked across dimensions. Patricia stared at the holographic document hovering above her desk, watching the alien script slowly morph into English through whatever technological wizardry made such things possible. The esteemed Council of Unified Galactic Territories requests the immediate deployment of experienced human military consultants to provide tactical advisement for our peacekeeping forces. Patricia read aloud, because talking to yourself was only crazy if someone caught you doing it. Experienced consultants with real combat knowledge, not theoretical strategists. Individuals who have survived actual warfare and can teach our forces the practical applications of conflict resolution? She blinked at that last part. That's the most diplomatically convoluted way of saying we don't know how to actually fight that I've ever seen, she muttered. The coffee maker burbled in agreement. Now, here's where things got interesting. The request specified veterans with combat experience, preferably from asymmetric warfare scenarios. Someone in the translation department, probably an intern, who was definitely not paid enough for this, decided that asymmetric warfare was code for guerrilla tactics. And what was the first major guerrilla conflict that popped into the historical database? Vietnam. By Thursday, Patricia had assembled a list of volunteers. By Friday, she was questioning every decision that led to this moment. "Let me get this straight," she said, looking at the roster on her tablet. "When I put out the call for volunteers, these are the people who responded." "Yes, ma'am," said her assistant, a young man named Derek, who had the perpetually startled expression of someone who had just realized they'd chosen the wrong career path. 17 volunteers, average age 73, all Vietnam veterans, all, very enthusiastic about the opportunity. Enthusiastic? One of them asked if the aliens had beer. Another wanted to know if space had better fishing than Earth. A third asked if his VA benefits would cover intergalactic travel insurance. Patricia rubbed her temples. And why didn't any younger veterans volunteer? "They're busy, ma'am. Actual jobs, families, responsibilities. The Vietnam vets, well..." Derek trailed off diplomatically. "They have time," Patricia finished, "and probably think this is hilarious." One of them called it the best punchline to a really long joke, ma'am. Patricia looked at the list again. Names like Hank Kowalski, Jimmy Nguyen, Robert Bulldog Morrison, and Eddie Ramirez stared back at her. These were men who had seen real combat 50-some years ago, who had survived a war that America would rather forget, who had come home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge them. Men who had spent decades dealing with memories that didn't fade and wounds that still ached when it rained. And now they were volunteering to go to space to teach aliens how to fight. "You know what?" Patricia said finally. "Screw it, send them." "Ma'am?" The Council asked for experienced combat veterans. They didn't specify age. They wanted people who survived asymmetric warfare. Well, these guys invented half the tactics in the modern guerrilla warfare handbook. If the Council wants advisors, they're getting advisors. Derek hesitated. The Council is expecting... I think they're expecting military officers, professionals. People in uniform who salute and follow protocols. Patricia smiled for the first time that week. Then they're in for a hell of a surprise, aren't they? 3 weeks later, transport vessel K-77 docked at the Council's primary military station, a structure so impossibly large that calling it a station was like calling the Pacific Ocean damp. The thing was the size of a small moon, bristling with enough defensive weaponry to sterilize a solar system, and had a bureaucratic infrastructure that would make the IRS weep with envy. Commander Thel Knox of the Vertalian Empire stood at the docking bay, all 7 feet of crystalline blue authority, flanked by an honor guard of the Council's finest soldiers. These were beings from 100 different worlds, each representing the pinnacle of their species' military prowess. They stood at perfect attention, their ceremonial armor gleaming, their faces set in expressions of stoic professionalism. Thel Knox had prepared a speech. It was a good speech. He'd worked on it for 3 days, carefully balancing diplomatic courtesy with military authority. It acknowledged humanity's recent entry into galactic society while emphasizing the honor and responsibility of this assignment. It was exactly 17 minutes long, which was considered appropriately respectful without being tediously excessive. The airlock hissed open. 17 humans shuffled out, and Thel Knox's speech died somewhere between his primary consciousness and his secondary vocal chamber. These were not what he expected. These humans were old, not elderly in the refined, dignified sense that Vortalian elders carried themselves. These humans looked like they'd been through a war, then a few more wars, then maybe a particularly aggressive divorce, and then decided to say "fuck it" and show up anyway. They wore mismatched clothing. One had a cap that said, "I survived the shit," in garish yellow letters. Another had sunglasses that were definitely not standard military issue. A third was eating something from a crinkly bag and getting crumbs on the pristine docking bay floor. The one in front, a stocky human with graying hair and a face that suggested he'd seen things that would make a void dweller reconsider their life choices, stepped forward and looked around the docking bay with the expression of someone evaluating a used car. "Huh," he said, "fancier than Da Nang." Thel Knox's translator implant worked overtime on that reference and came up with nothing useful. "I am Commander Thel Knox of the—" he began. Yeah, we got the briefing," the human interrupted, which was already a breach of 17 different protocols. "I'm Hank Kowalski. That's Jimmy, that's Bulldog, that's Eddie, that's Ray, that's Pete, and honestly I'm gonna forget everyone's name in about 5 minutes, so let's just use nicknames. You got coffee here?" Thel Knox's honor guard exchanged glances. This was not going according to the ceremonial welcome protocols. "Coffee?" Thel Knox repeated, his translator double-checking that it had processed the word correctly. "Yeah, you know, coffee. Brown liquid, tastes like ambition and bad decisions, keeps you functional when everything's going to hell. Please tell me you guys have coffee. We have nutritional beverages that provide—" "So that's a no," Hank said, turning to the others. "Boys, we're gonna have to fix that first." One of the other humans, a tall, lean man with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little, spoke up. "Hank, maybe we should let the nice alien finish his speech before we critique the amenities. Eddie, we flew 3 weeks through space in a tin can that smelled like recycled farts. I think I've earned the right to ask about coffee." Thel Knox tried again. "Honored human consultants on behalf of the Galactic Council, I welcome you to—" "Question," another human interrupted. This one had a scar across his cheek, and the kind of grin that suggested he found chaos amusing. "You guys ever actually been in a fight? Like, a real one, not a simulation?" The silence that followed could have frozen hydrogen. "The Council's peacekeeping forces are trained in—" Thel Knox began stiffly. "That's a no," the scarred human, apparently named Bulldog, said to the others. "They've never been in a real fight." "How can you possibly know that?" demanded one of Thel Knox's officers, a Zenthorian whose scales were flushing an indignant purple. Bulldog gestured vaguely at the assembled honor guard. You're all standing at attention like you're on parade. Nobody who's actually been shot at stands that straight. You keep your knees bent, stay loose, always ready to move. You stand like that in the field. You're a sniper's wet dream. The honor guard, despite themselves, shifted slightly. Several pairs of knees bent almost imperceptibly. Hank nodded approvingly. See, they're learning already. Now about that coffee situation. The first meeting took place in conference room Theta 9, which was designed to accommodate 50 different species with vastly different atmospheric, gravitational and spatial requirements. It was a marvel of engineering and diplomatic architecture. The humans took one look at it and immediately dragged all the chairs into a circle. "What are you doing?" demanded Thelnox, watching in horror as the humans completely ignored the carefully arranged seating hierarchy that had taken the protocol office 3 hours to organize. "Making it so we can actually talk to each other," Hank said, settling into a chair with a grunt. "All that formal stuff with the ranks and the tiers, that's great for making people feel important, but it's shit for actual communication. The seating arrangement reflects the command structure and creates artificial barriers between people who need to share information," interrupted Jimmy, the one Hank had pointed out earlier. He had the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make people listen. "You want us to teach your people, or you want us to participate in a bureaucratic circle jerk?" Thelnox's translator flagged that last term as potentially obscene, but couldn't quite pin down the exact meaning. He decided to ignore it. "Very well," he said, settling into the circle with as much dignity as he could muster, which was considerable. Vortalians were good at dignity. "Let us begin. The Council has brought you here to provide tactical advisement for our military forces. We have reviewed your species' military history and believe that your unconventional approaches to warfare could provide valuable insights." "Unconventional," Hank repeated, grinning. "That's a nice way of saying we made it up as we went along." "Your species has demonstrated remarkable adaptability in combat situations," Thelnox continued, determined to maintain some semblance of formality. "The Council's forces are highly trained in conventional warfare, but we lack practical experience in field conditions." "How long's it been since you guys had a real war?" asked Ray, another veteran who'd been quietly observing until now. Thelnox consulted his data pad. The last significant military conflict concluded approximately 473 years ago. The humans exchanged looks. 400 years of peace, Eddie said slowly. "And you still have a military?" "Of course. The preservation of peace requires bureaucratic justification and budget allocation," Hank finished. "Yeah, we know how that works. So you've got all these soldiers who've never actually fought, and now something's got you worried enough to call in outside help. What happened?" Thelnox hesitated. This was the part he'd been dreading. "There was an incident. 6 months ago, one of our patrol vessels encountered a hostile entity. A single small craft, probably pirates or raiders, nothing our forces hadn't handled 1,000 times in simulations. And, Bulldog prompted, and the patrol vessel, crewed by 15 of our best-trained soldiers, equipped with weapon systems capable of vaporizing a small asteroid. They panicked. They followed every protocol, executed every maneuver exactly as trained, and still they froze when actual weapons fire started. 3 soldiers suffered psychological breakdowns. The rest were too paralyzed by analysis to respond effectively. The hostile craft escaped. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. The humans weren't smirking now. "Nobody got hurt?" Jimmy asked quietly. "No. The hostile craft's weapons were inadequate. They caused minimal damage, but the incident revealed a fundamental problem. Our soldiers train endlessly, but they've never faced a situation where the stakes are real, where the enemy doesn't follow the simulation parameters, where things go wrong in ways they weren't trained for." Hank leaned back in his chair. "You need your people to learn how to handle the fear. We need them to function despite the fear," Thelnox corrected. "Same thing," Hank said. And you think 17 old guys who can't run 3 miles without needing a bathroom break are going to fix this problem? I think, Thelnox said carefully, that 17 old guys who survived a war they weren't prepared for in conditions that would break most beings might know something about functioning when everything goes to hell. The question is whether you can teach it. Bulldog laughed, sharp and short. You can't teach people not to be afraid. Fear's not the problem. Fear keeps you alive. You teach them to make decisions while afraid. You teach them that plans fall apart, equipment fails, and the enemy's going to do something completely insane at the worst possible moment. You teach them to adapt. And how do you propose to teach that? Asked one of Thelnox's advisors, a female Quentarian whose 4 eyes blinked in skeptical succession. By doing exactly what's making you uncomfortable right now, Jimmy said. We stop following the protocol. We stop pretending war is predictable. We start making them think instead of just following the manual. Thelnox felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, something that his species had evolved past centuries ago, but still lurked in the genetic memory of every sentient being. Apprehension. When do we begin? He asked. Hank grinned. Soon as somebody points us to the cafeteria. I haven't had a decent meal since we left Earth, and I'm not teaching anyone anything until I've got some real food in me. Your nutritional paste tastes like sadness and recycling. The first training session was scheduled for 0600 hours the following morning. The Council's elite training battalion, consisting of 200 of the finest soldiers from 50 different worlds, assembled in Formation Yard 7 with the kind of precision that came from 10,000 hours of drill. At 0630, the humans finally showed up. At 0700, they were still showing up, drifting in with paper cups of something they'd managed to brew in their quarters that smelled like burned ambition and tasted like punishment. The Council's soldiers stood in perfect formation, watching in confusion as the humans wandered around, chatting, pointing at things, completely ignoring the fact that this was supposed to be a formal training commencement. Major Klexnor, the battalion commander, approached Hank with barely contained irritation. You are 47 minutes late. In the Council military, punctuality is a way to make people stand around and waste time. Hank finished his coffee, which he'd acquired through means he refused to explain, involving a maintenance closet, some spare parts, and what he described as good old-fashioned American ingenuity. Look, Major, we're gonna need to establish something right now. You want us to teach your people. We do it our way. That means we show up when we're ready, not when some arbitrary schedule says we should. Klexner's facial tendrils quivered with indignation. The schedule ensures order and conditions people to wait for orders instead of taking initiative, Jimmy said, walking up beside Hank. Tell me, Major, if your enemy attacks at 0600 and your soldiers are trained to always start at 0600, what happens when the attack comes at 0400? They would adapt and... Would they? Bulldog interjected. Or would they hesitate because it's not the right time? Because that's not what the schedule says. You're training them to be predictable, and predictable soldiers are dead soldiers. Klexnor looked at Thelnox, who had observed the exchange with interest. Commander, this is highly irregular. Yes, Thelnox said. That is precisely why we hired them. Proceed, Major. Klexnor turned back to the assembled battalion. Attention! Today we begin advanced tactical training under the supervision of human consultants. You will... Yes, stop that, Hank interrupted. Everybody relax. Come on, break formation. Stand normal. Jesus, you all look like you're about to get a rectal probe. The translator struggled with that last reference, while the battalion soldiers looked at each other uncertainly. That's an order, Hank added. Break formation. Stand however you want. Slowly, uncertainly, the soldiers broke ranks. Some remained standing straight. Others shifted weight. A few looked genuinely confused about what standing normal even meant. Eddie walked through the groups, hands in his pockets, looking utterly non-military. Okay, so here's the first lesson. You ready? This is important. He paused for effect. Everything you've learned is wrong. You could have heard a molecule drop. Not useless, Eddie clarified. Wrong. There's a difference. All that tactical training, all those simulations, all those perfect maneuvers, they're based on the assumption that war follows rules, that the enemy will do what you expect, that equipment works when you need it, that plans survive contact with reality. He pulled out a small object from his pocket. It looked like a rock. This is a rock, Eddie said. Basic, stupid, been around since planets formed. Now, in all your fancy training, did anybody teach you how to use a rock as a weapon? The soldiers exchanged glances. One, a brave Hydraxian, spoke up. We have energy weapons, kinetic accelerators, plasma rifles. Why would we need a rock? Because your energy weapon's battery died. Because your kinetic accelerator jammed. Because your plasma rifle overheated and you're stuck in a building with enemies coming through the door. What do? Silence. You use the rock, Eddie said, or a chair, or a piece of pipe, or your teeth if that's all you've got. The weapon doesn't matter. Your brain matters. Your willingness to adapt matters. Your ability to look at what you have instead of what you should have. That's what keeps you alive. Ray stepped forward. We're going to teach you the most important military tactics that no training manual will ever include. Tactics like how to sleep anywhere because you might not get another chance. Like how to tell which officer's orders are going to get you killed. Like how to make decisions with incomplete information because you'll never have complete information. Like how to keep going when you're tired and scared and everything hurts and you just want to go home. Pete, who'd been quiet until now, added, and we're going to teach you the most important thing of all, how to survive not just the enemy, but your own command structure. That got everyone's attention. Klexnor stepped forward, tendrils quivering dangerously. Are you suggesting that I'm suggesting that more soldiers die from bad orders than enemy fire? Pete said flatly. I'm suggesting that knowing when to follow the plan and when to say, screw this, I'm doing something different, is the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. I'm suggesting that blind obedience is a great way to get your people killed. The training yard had gone completely silent. Thel Knox, watching from the observation deck, felt that apprehension again. These humans weren't just teaching different tactics. They were questioning the fundamental structure of military authority that the Council had maintained for millennia. He should stop this. He should reassert proper protocol. He should remind everyone that the Council's military traditions were based on centuries of proven success. But they hadn't been proven, had they? Not in actual combat, not where it mattered. He tapped his communicator. Let them continue. Down in the yard, Hank was addressing the battalion. Okay, here's how this works. For the next 6 weeks, you're gonna unlearn everything that makes you comfortable. We're gonna run drills where the equipment fails, where the plan falls apart, where your officers give contradictory orders, where everything that can go wrong does go wrong. We're gonna make you miserable, confused, and frustrated. Why? Asked a young Plenthian soldier. Hank smiled grimly. Because that's what real combat is. And if you can learn to function in that chaos, if you can learn to make decisions when nothing makes sense, if you can learn to trust your instincts over your training manual, then maybe, just maybe, when the real thing happens, you won't freeze up and wait for someone to tell you what to do. Jimmy walked forward. First exercise. Right now, this minute, there's an enemy force attacking the station's eastern docking bay. You need to organize a response. Go. The soldiers stood there waiting. I said, go! Jimmy shouted. Still nothing. The soldiers looked at Klexnor, waiting for orders. That's the problem, Bulldog said, disgusted. You're waiting for someone to tell you what to do. The enemy's not waiting. They're already shooting. People are dying while you stand here with your thumbs up your asses, waiting for permission to do your jobs. One soldier, a Quentarian female, suddenly broke from the group and started running toward the eastern sector. Then another followed. Then 3 more. That's what we're looking for, Hank called after them. Initiative. The rest of you just failed the first test. You're dead. The enemy's already taken the docking bay while you waited for orders that aren't coming." The remaining soldiers looked stricken. "Don't feel bad," Eddie said. "You just learned the first real lesson. In combat, the person who acts first usually wins. The person who waits for perfect information or perfect orders usually dies. Now let's try it again, and again, and again, until you stop thinking and start doing." The training continued for hours. The humans ran the soldiers through scenario after scenario, each one designed to be confusing, contradictory, and frustrating. Equipment failed at critical moments. Orders contradicted each other. Objectives changed mid-mission. The rule was simple. There were no rules. Adapt or fail. By midday, the elite battalion looked less like a military unit and more like a group of college students after finals week. Exhausted, confused, and questioning everything they thought they knew. "This is chaos," Klexenor complained to Thelnox during a break. "They're destroying unit cohesion, undermining authority, teaching our soldiers to disobey orders." "Are they?" Thelnox watched as Hank demonstrated something to a group of soldiers, using hand gestures and what appeared to be a hastily drawn diagram on the ground. "Or are they teaching our soldiers to think? There's a difference between thinking and—" "Major, when that hostile craft attacked our patrol, do you know what the crew did? They sent a request for instructions up the chain of command. They waited for authorization to return fire. They followed every protocol. And while they did that, the enemy escaped, not because our soldiers weren't trained, because they were trained too well. They knew exactly what to do in a simulation, but reality doesn't wait for authorization." Klexenor watched as one of the human instructors, a quiet man named Ray, sat down with a Vortalian soldier who looked on the verge of tears. Ray said something too quiet to hear, and the soldier nodded, wiping at his crystalline eyes. "They're breaking them," Klexenor said. "No," Thelnox corrected. "They're showing them that it's okay to be broken, and that you can still function anyway. That might be the most important lesson of all." The weeks that followed were unlike anything the Council's military had ever experienced. The humans didn't teach tactics in the traditional sense. They taught survival. Not just physical survival, but psychological survival. How to deal with fear, exhaustion, frustration, and the terrible uncertainty that came with real combat. They taught the soldiers how to make coffee from ration packs and rainwater, how to sleep with one eye open, how to tell which sounds meant danger and which were just the station settling, how to read people, because sometimes knowing if someone was lying was more important than knowing which end of the weapon pointed at the enemy. They taught them card games, which seemed ridiculous until the soldiers realized they were learning probability assessment and reading opponents' tells. They taught them how to barter, trade, and negotiate, skills that military training had deemed unnecessary. They taught them how to complain effectively without undermining morale, which was apparently an art form. And slowly, gradually, the soldiers began to change. They stopped moving in perfect formation. They started questioning orders, not in a rebellious way, but in a "why are we doing this, and is there a better approach" way. They began making decisions without waiting for authorization. They started looking relaxed, which paradoxically made them more ready for action, not less. The humans rarely did formal instruction. Instead, they told stories. Long, rambling stories about things that went wrong in Vietnam, about decisions made in seconds that meant life or death, about the absurdity and terror and boredom and chaos of war. Stories that had no clear moral or lesson, but somehow taught more than any tactical manual. One evening, Jimmy sat with a group of soldiers in what the humans had christened the break room, which was really just an abandoned storage bay they'd filled with salvaged furniture and a coffee maker that Hank had built from spare parts and sheer determination. "So there we were," Jimmy said, and the soldiers leaned in because they'd learned that "so there we were" always preceded a good story. 3 days into the jungle, completely lost because the map was wrong. which happened about every third mission. Radio's dead. We've got maybe 2 days of rations left. And Peterson, our squad leader, is insisting we need to proceed to the objective." "What was the objective?" asked a young Quentarian. "Hell if I knew. Some village that may or may not have existed. Command had gotten intelligence from somewhere, and we were supposed to investigate, which meant walk into the jungle and see what happened." "That's not a plan," the Quentarian said. "Welcome to war, kid. Anyway, Peterson wants to keep going. The rest of us want to head back, get resupplied, figure out where we actually are before we keep wandering around. And we're sitting there arguing about it when Johnson, the quietest guy in the squad, just stands up and starts walking." "Where was he going?" "North, just north." Peterson asks what he's doing, and Johnson says, "Following the birds." We all think he's lost his mind, but Johnson explains that he's been watching the birds fly over every morning at dawn, always heading the same direction, and birds generally fly toward water and food. So if we're lost, we follow the birds. "Did it work?" Jimmy smiled. "We found a river 2 hours later, followed it downstream, found a village, got resupplied, completed the mission. All because Johnson ignored the plan, ignored the orders, and trusted his eyes over the map." He looked around at the assembled soldiers. "That's the lesson. Trust your senses. Trust your instincts. Trust what you can see over what you're told. The map's going to be wrong. The plan's going to fall apart. The orders are going to be based on information that's outdated before you even hear them. But your eyes, your ears, your gut telling you something's not right? Those don't lie." Another soldier spoke up. "But we're trained to trust our equipment. Our senses are far more accurate than—" "Your senses can be jammed, hacked, or just plain wrong," Bulldog interjected, walking over with 2 cups of coffee. "Here's a question for you all. How many of you have had your sensor systems fail during training?" A few hands went up. "How many of you still trusted the sensors over your own observations?" The hands stayed up. "That's gonna get you killed. Equipment fails. It's not if, it's when. You need to be able to function without it. You need to trust yourself more than you trust your tools." Ray, who'd been quietly listening, added, "But here's the flip side. Sometimes your instincts are wrong. Sometimes the fear's lying to you. Sometimes you need to do the thing that terrifies you because it's the right tactical choice. Knowing the difference, that's the hard part. That's what keeps you alive." "So which is it?" the Quentarian asked, frustrated. "Trust our instincts or ignore them." "Yes," all 3 humans said simultaneously. The soldiers groaned. "Welcome to combat," Hank said, appearing with a plate of something he'd convinced the station's food synthesizer to create, which looked like it might have been food in a past life. "Nothing's ever clear. You're going to have to make decisions with incomplete information, trust your gut while knowing it might be wrong, and somehow survive anyway. Anybody who tells you they've got a formula for this is lying. You just do the best you can and hope it's enough." The conversation continued late into the night. The humans told more stories, answered questions, and occasionally lapsed into arguments among themselves about what had actually happened during various missions, which the soldiers found both entertaining and educational. This became the pattern: official training during the day, which was structured chaos, and unofficial gatherings at night, where the real teaching happened, where soldiers could ask questions they'd never ask a superior officer, where they could admit fears and doubts, where they could learn that even these experienced warriors had been terrified, had made mistakes, had questioned everything. It was working, slowly, but working. Then came week 4, and everything went to hell. The Council's Executive Committee, the governing body that oversaw all military operations, decided they wanted a demonstration. They wanted to see what their considerable investment in human consultants had produced. They wanted quantifiable results, measurable improvements, and most importantly, they wanted to be impressed. The humans were told about this on a Tuesday. The demonstration was scheduled for Friday. The committee would observe a combat readiness exercise showcasing the battalion's improved capabilities. Hank's response was concise. Absolutely not. Thelnox, delivering this news in person, had expected resistance. He had not expected flat refusal. This is not a request, Consultant Kowalski. The committee has the authority to... I don't care if they have the authority to rename Jupiter. We're not doing a dog and pony show for a bunch of bureaucrats who want to feel important. The committee needs to see results. They need to justify the expenditure of... They need to get their heads out of their collective asses, Bulldog snapped. You can't measure this. You can't put ability to function under stress into a nice, neat graph. You can't demonstrate learning to trust your instincts in a staged exercise. This isn't a performance. Eddie, usually the most diplomatic of the group, looked genuinely angry. You bring in observers. You turn this into theater. The soldiers will perform for the committee instead of learning. They'll do what looks good instead of what's effective. You'll undo 4 weeks of work in one afternoon. I understand your concerns, Thelnox said carefully, but the committee has questions. They see the training methods as unorthodox. They're concerned about unit cohesion, respect for authority, and they're concerned we're teaching soldiers to think, Jimmy finished, because thinking soldiers are harder to control. Soldiers who question orders are less predictable. Soldiers who trust themselves over the system are a threat to people who like the system the way it is. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. That's not, Thelnox began. It's exactly that, Hank said, but not unkindly. Look, Commander, we get it. You've got a power structure. People in charge who want to stay in charge. Change threatens that. But you asked us here to fix a problem. You can't fix the problem and keep everyone comfortable. Pick one. Thelnox's crystalline features didn't show emotion the way human faces did, but something in his posture suggested frustration. The committee will not accept a refusal. If you don't provide a demonstration, they'll terminate the program. Then terminate it, Bulldog said. We're not compromising the training for politics. If they terminate the program, you'll be sent back to Earth. We're old, Commander. We've been sent to worse places. Thelnox looked at each of them in turn. These stubborn, infuriating humans who had somehow managed to change his perspective on everything he thought he knew about military training. Who had taken his soldiers and turned them into something different, not worse, not better, just different in a way he couldn't quite quantify. What if, he said slowly, what if I could arrange for the committee to observe without the soldiers knowing? Would that be acceptable? The humans exchanged glances. Hidden observation, Jimmy asked. They watch but don't interfere. The soldiers wouldn't know they were being evaluated. It would be a normal training exercise. Hank considered this. What kind of exercise? That would be up to you. Whatever you deem appropriate. More glances between the humans. Some kind of silent communication happened, the kind that came from decades of reading each other in situations where words could get you killed. All right, Hank said finally, but we do this our way. No scripts, no staged scenarios. We're going to run them through something real, something messy, and the committee's going to see exactly what we've been teaching, including the parts they're not going to like. Thelnox felt that apprehension again. What do you have in mind? Hank's grin was absolutely predatory. You'll see, just make sure your committee members have strong constitutions. Friday arrived with the kind of ominous inevitability usually reserved for tax audits and dental appointments. The executive committee assembled in the observation deck overlooking Training Complex Delta, which was essentially a small city designed for urban combat exercises. 17 committee members, representing the major factions of the council, settled into their comfortable viewing stations with the air of people preparing to judge a performance. They had expectations. They expected to see disciplined formations, coordinated tactics, and impressive displays of the advanced weaponry the council had spent centuries developing. They expected to see results that justified the considerable expense of bringing these primitive humans aboard. They expected a show. What they got was considerably different. The exercise began normally enough. The battalion was divided into two forces, attackers and defenders. The defenders were tasked with holding a fortified position in the complex. The attackers needed to breach the defenses and secure 3 objectives. Standard military exercise, the kind they'd run 10,000 times. Then Hank's voice crackled over the comm system, transmitted to both forces simultaneously. "Okay, here's the situation. All your commanding officers just got killed by a surprise attack. No chain of command, no clear leadership. Figure it out yourselves. And by the way, half your communication systems just failed. Oh, and your primary weapons are jammed. Go!" The committee members looked at each other in confusion. "What is the purpose of this?" demanded Committee Chair Velsoran, a Hydraxian whose tentacles were already twitching with irritation. "This violates every principle of command structure." "Just watch," Thelnox said quietly. He'd been briefed on the exercise exactly 30 seconds before it started, which had been the humans' entire plan. Even he didn't know what was coming. Down in the complex, chaos erupted. The soldiers, suddenly leaderless and without reliable communication, did exactly what they'd been trained not to do for centuries. They adapted. The attacking force, instead of waiting for new orders, immediately broke into small groups. A Zenthorian soldier grabbed the nearest 3 others and pointed toward a side entrance. They moved. A Quentarian started organizing ammunition redistribution, sharing working weapons with those whose had failed. Someone started using hand signals, something the humans had taught them during Week 2. The defending force was equally chaotic, but equally effective. Without officers to coordinate the defense, the soldiers started making decisions on the fly. A Plenthian engineer immediately began rigging improvised barriers from available materials. 2 soldiers abandoned their assigned positions entirely, moving to what they identified as more tactically sound locations. "This is anarchy," Velsoran declared. "Where is the organization?" "Watch," Thelnox repeated. 20 minutes into the exercise, the attacking force had breached the first defensive line using tactics that weren't in any manual. They'd created a distraction by deliberately triggering alarm systems in the wrong sector, drawing defenders away from their actual entry point. They'd used ration packs and spare equipment to create false sensor signatures. They'd moved in completely unpredictable patterns because there was no pattern, no plan, just constant adaptation to changing circumstances. The defending force, equally creative, had turned the complex's environmental systems against the attackers, flooding certain corridors with harmless but obscuring vapor. They'd relocated their defense points 3 times, refusing to hold positions that became tactically unsound. They'd even started negotiating with some of the attackers, attempting psychological warfare that no simulation had ever included. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was absolutely nothing like proper military operations. It was also completely effective. "I don't understand," complained another committee member. "They're ignoring protocols. They're abandoning assigned positions. They're making independent decisions without authorization." Eddie's voice came over the committee's private comm channel. The humans had somehow hacked it, because of course they had. That's the point. War doesn't wait for authorization. The enemy doesn't care about your protocols. You wanted to see what we taught them. This is it. The ability to function when everything goes to hell. The exercise continued for 2 hours. The humans kept introducing new complications. Supply lines were cut, reinforcements were delayed, intelligence was wrong. The weather simulation system created a localized storm that made sensors useless. And through it all, the soldiers adapted. They complained, they argued, they made mistakes, but they kept moving. They didn't freeze. They didn't wait for orders that weren't coming. They looked at the situation, made decisions, and acted. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. Finally, the attacking force secured the objectives. Not through superior firepower or brilliant strategy, but through sheer stubborn persistence and constant adaptation. They'd taken longer than a properly coordinated assault would have. They'd wasted resources. They'd violated approximately 400 protocols. They'd also succeeded, despite every possible thing going wrong. The committee was silent for a long moment after the exercise concluded. Then Velzorin spoke, his voice very quiet. "Those were not the soldiers we sent to training 4 weeks ago." "No," Thelnox agreed. "They're better. They're undisciplined. They questioned every parameter of the exercise. They abandoned their assignments. They demonstrated complete disregard for command authority." "They succeeded," Thelnox countered. "Against impossible odds, with every advantage stripped away, they still completed the mission. Isn't that what we need?" Another committee member, an elderly Vortalian named Shentok, spoke up. "I've been on this committee for 90 years. I've observed thousands of training exercises. I've never seen anything like that. It was disturbing and magnificent. And I'm not certain which disturbs me more." Hank's voice came over the comm again. "You want the Truth Committee? Your soldiers were excellent at following orders, perfect at executing plans, brilliant at doing exactly what they were told. But they were helpless the moment something unexpected happened, because you trained them to be tools, not thinkers. You made them dependent on a system that works great until it doesn't." "And what have you made them?" Velzorin demanded. "Survivors," Bulldog answered. "People who can function when the system fails, when the plan falls apart, when nobody's telling them what to do. You might not like it, but when the real shooting starts, you're going to be real glad they know how to think for themselves." The committee chambers erupted in argument. Half the members were appalled at the breakdown of military discipline. The other half were quietly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about combat readiness. Shentok raised a hand for silence. As the senior member, his word carried weight. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we are asking the wrong questions. The question is not whether these methods are proper. The question is whether they are effective. And I believe we have our answer. You cannot seriously be suggesting we adopt these, Velzorin struggled for words. "Chaotic, undisciplined, authority-questioning methods," Jimmy supplied helpfully over the comm. "Yeah, that's exactly what he's suggesting. Because when that next hostile craft shows up, when your soldiers are facing a real enemy who doesn't care about your protocols, they're gonna need to be chaotic, undisciplined, and willing to question authority, or they're gonna die waiting for orders." The debate continued for hours. The committee was deeply divided. Some saw the value in what the humans taught. Others saw only the threat to the established order. Military tradition versus practical necessity. Control versus effectiveness. Finally, Thelnox made a decision that would later be considered either brilliant or catastrophic, depending on who you asked. "The program continues," he announced. "Committee approval is noted but not required. I have operational authority over military training, and I'm exercising it. The humans stay." Velzorin's tentacles went rigid. "Commander, you are overstepping your—" "I'm doing my job," Thelnox said, "which is to prepare our forces for actual combat, not to make the committee comfortable. You wanted advisors who could teach our soldiers to handle real threats. We have those advisors. Whether you like their methods is irrelevant." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either violent agreement or violent disagreement. In galactic politics, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. Shentok broke it with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Well, it seems the humans aren't the only ones who've learned to question authority. Very well, Commander, the program continues. But understand this. You're betting your career on these primitive warriors and their chaotic philosophy." "I'm betting on effectiveness," Thelnox corrected, "and I'll take effective chaos over organized helplessness any day." The committee adjourned. Some members were furious, some were thoughtful. All were disturbed by what they'd witnessed, though for different reasons. Down in the training complex, the humans were debriefing the soldiers. "You all did good," Hank told the assembled battalion. "Not perfect. You made mistakes. You hesitated sometimes. You second-guessed yourselves. But you moved, you adapted, you kept going. That's what matters. A Vortalian soldier raised a crystalline hand. Consultant Kowalski, the observers seemed displeased. Fuck the observers, Bulldog said cheerfully. They're comfortable bureaucrats who haven't seen real action in centuries. They wanted a nice, clean demonstration that made them feel good about their budget allocation. Instead, they saw what combat actually looks like. Messy, confused, and nothing like the simulations. Of course they're displeased. But will they terminate the program? Another soldier asked. Jimmy shook his head. Probably not, because despite everything, you succeeded. And success is hard to argue with. They might not like how you did it, but they can't deny that you did it. Ray stepped forward. Here's what you need to understand. There will always be people who value order over effectiveness, who care more about following the rules than winning, who'd rather lose properly than win messily. You can't change those people, but you can prove them wrong by staying alive when everyone said you couldn't. The debriefing continued. The humans went through the exercise, pointing out what worked and what didn't. They praised initiative and criticized hesitation. They emphasized that perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was. As the soldiers dispersed, Thelnox approached the humans. That was educational, he said carefully. You're welcome, Hank replied, and I'm guessing we just made you very unpopular with your bosses. I've been unpopular before. It builds character. Thelnox paused. Thank you. For showing them the truth, even though it was uncomfortable. Truth usually is, Eddie said. Comfortable lies are easier, but they get people killed. Indeed. Thelnox looked at the complex, where soldiers were still milling around discussing the exercise. They've changed, not just in capability, but in attitude. They question things now. They argue. They make suggestions. 6 weeks ago, they would never have dared. Is that a problem? Jimmy asked. I don't know, Thelnox admitted. It's certainly different. Whether it's a problem or an improvement, I suppose we'll find out when the shooting starts. If it helps, Hank said. Back home, the soldiers who questioned things, who argued with bad orders, who trusted themselves over the system, those were the ones who came home. The ones who blindly followed orders? A lot of them didn't. Thelnox nodded slowly. There's something I've been meaning to ask. Why did you volunteer for this? You've been not exactly forthcoming about your reasons. The humans exchanged glances again, that silent communication thing. You want to take this one? Hank asked Eddie. Eddie shrugged. Sure. Commander, when we came home from Vietnam, nobody wanted to hear what we'd learned. Nobody wanted our advice. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that we'd survived something that broke a lot of people. We were inconvenient, reminders of an unpopular war. So we got ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Then you came along, Ray continued, asking for exactly what we had to offer. Experience, survival skills, the ability to function when everything goes to hell. You wanted what everyone else had rejected. That's something we couldn't pass up. Bulldog grinned. Plus, it's hilarious watching you fancy aliens deal with a bunch of old guys who don't give a shit about your protocols. That's worth the trip right there. And the fishing's terrible here, Pete added, so we might as well do something useful. Thelnox's translator struggled with the mixture of sincerity and sarcasm, ultimately giving up and just flagging the entire conversation as emotionally complex. Well, he said finally, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here, even if you are the most difficult advisors the Council has ever employed. We'll take that as a compliment, Hank said. The following week saw a shift in the training. The humans, having proven their methods worked, were given more autonomy. They started bringing in soldiers from other battalions, spreading the knowledge wider. They trained instructors who could carry on their methods after they left. But they also started teaching something else, something harder to quantify. They taught the soldiers about the cost of war, about what it did to you, even when you survived. About the weight of decisions made in seconds that haunted you for years, about the friends you lost and the scars that didn't heal. One evening, Jimmy sat with a group of younger soldiers in the break room. They'd just completed a particularly brutal exercise, one designed to simulate what happened when you had to choose between two bad options, when someone was going to die, no matter what you decided. The soldiers were quiet, processing what they'd experienced even in simulation. "Does it get easier?" one asked finally, a young Quentarian whose 4 eyes were dim with exhaustion. Jimmy considered the question for a long moment. "No, it doesn't. You get better at making the decisions. You get faster, but it never gets easy. And if it does get easy, if you stop feeling the weight of it, that's when you need to worry." "How do you live with it?" another asked. "With the decisions you made?" "Badly sometimes," Jimmy admitted. "You carry it. You talk about it with people who understand. You try to find meaning in it, some way to make it worth something. And you hope that the people you saved outnumber the people you couldn't." Ray spoke up from across the room. "And you remember that freezing up, making no decision, that also has a cost. Sometimes the best you can do is choose the least terrible option and live with it." Nobody said survival was clean. The conversation drifted into darker territory after that. The soldiers asked questions they'd never asked their regular officers. Questions about fear, doubt, guilt. Questions about what combat actually did to you. Questions about whether you could ever really go back to normal afterward. The humans answered honestly, sometimes brutally so. They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't pretend it was noble or glorious. They described war as what it was, necessary sometimes, terrible always, and something that changed you in ways that never fully healed. "Why are you telling us this?" the Quentarian asked. "The regular instructors always talk about honor and duty and they're not wrong," Bulldog interrupted. "Honor matters, duty matters, but they're not enough. You need to know what you're actually signing up for. You need to understand that combat isn't what it looks like in simulations. It's not clean, it's not heroic. It's chaos and terror and making impossible choices and living with the consequences." "Oh, so why do it?" another soldier asked. "Why fight at all?" Hank had been listening quietly. Now he spoke. "Because sometimes the alternative is worse. Because sometimes people need defending. Because sometimes you're the only one who can. Not because it's glorious, not because you want to, but because it's necessary, and you're the poor bastard who happened to be there." Eddie nodded. "And because if you don't know what you're getting into, if you go in thinking it's going to be like the simulations, thinking you're going to be a hero, thinking it's going to mean something, that's when it breaks you. But if you go in knowing it's going to be hell, knowing you're going to make mistakes, knowing you're going to carry it forever, then at least you're prepared." The soldiers absorbed this in silence. It wasn't the inspiring speech they'd expected. It wasn't the patriotic rhetoric they'd been raised on. It was just truth, uncomfortable and cold. But it was also oddly comforting, because it meant they weren't crazy for being scared. They weren't weak for having doubts. They were just human, or alien, or whatever. They were just people facing something terrible and trying to survive it. This became another pattern. The official training taught them how to fight. These evening conversations taught them why to fight, and more importantly, what fighting cost. Week 7 brought an unexpected development. The Council received intelligence about potential hostile activity in a border system, not confirmed, just concerning. The kind of situation that might be nothing or might be the beginning of something bad. They wanted to send a reconnaissance team, and they wanted some of the newly trained soldiers to go. Thelnox called the humans to his office to discuss it. "Absolutely not," was Hank's immediate response. "They're ready," Thelnox insisted. "They've trained for—" "Training isn't the same as real," Eddie snapped. "You send them out there. They might freeze up. They might panic. They might get themselves killed because simulation stress isn't real stress." "Then they'll never be ready," Thelnox said. "If we never give them real missions because they might fail, what's the point of training them at all?" The humans looked at each other. "He's got a point," Bulldog admitted reluctantly. "Still don't like it," Ray muttered. Jimmy rubbed his face tiredly. How many soldiers? What's the mission profile? Who's in command? 6 soldiers. Reconnaissance only, no engagement. They're just observing and reporting. And the command is, well, that's complicated. Normally it would be an experienced officer, but you want them to function without an experienced officer, Hank finished. You want to see if they can handle a real situation with the independence we've been teaching them. Yes, that's either the smartest or stupidest idea you've had, Bulldog said. Possibly both. We're sending a support ship, Thelnox added. If things go wrong, we can extract them immediately. Things always go wrong, Pete said. That's Murphy's law. And Murphy was an optimist. More silence as the humans considered. Okay, Hank said finally. But we picked the soldiers, we picked the team composition, and we briefed them ourselves. No interference from the regular command structure. Agreed. And if this goes sideways, if they get hurt because you pushed them too fast, then I'll take full responsibility, Thelnox said. But we need to know if the training works. In real conditions, not simulations. Nah. The humans spent 2 days selecting the team. They chose carefully, balancing skills and personalities. They picked soldiers who'd shown initiative, adaptability, and the ability to handle stress. They also picked soldiers who'd shown the most improvement, who'd gone from rigid protocol followers to flexible thinkers. The 6 soldiers were assembled in a briefing room. They looked nervous, which was actually a good sign. Soldiers who weren't nervous before a real mission were either foolish or lying. All right, Hank began. Here's the situation. Border system, possible hostile activity, need eyes on the ground. This is real, not a simulation, not a test. If you screw up, the consequences are real. If you get hurt, you actually get hurt. Everyone clear on that? Nods all around. Good. Now forget everything I just said. You treat this exactly like a training exercise. Same adaptation, same flexibility, same willingness to improvise. The only difference is the stakes. But the approach, identical. You encounter something unexpected. Deal with it. Your equipment fails. Adapt. The mission parameters change. Adjust. You do not freeze. You do not panic. You keep your heads and you keep moving. Questions? A Plenthian soldier raised a hand. What if we encounter actual hostiles? Then you run, Eddie said bluntly. This is reconnaissance, not combat. Your job is to observe and report, not engage. You see an enemy, you avoid them. They see you, you evade them. They engage you, you retreat. Your ego is not worth your life. Clear. Clear. Jimmy stepped forward. One more thing. You're going to be scared out there. That's normal. That's good. Fear keeps you alert, but don't let it paralyze you. Remember your training. Remember that you can handle the unexpected. Remember that the plan will fall apart, and that's okay, because you know how to adapt. Ray added, and remember that making a decision and being wrong is better than not making a decision at all. You might make mistakes. That's fine. Learn from them. But do not freeze up waiting for perfect information or perfect orders. Move, act, survive. Bulldog grinned. And if everything goes to hell, remember, we taught you how to handle hell. You've got this. The soldiers deployed the next day. The humans watched from the command center alongside Thelnox, monitoring communications and sensor data. For the first 3 hours, everything went smoothly. The team inserted into the system, established the observation post, began monitoring the suspected activity. They worked well together, communicating efficiently, adapting to minor complications without hesitation. Then, inevitably, things went wrong. Their sensor suite malfunctioned. Not catastrophically, just enough to make their data unreliable. The kind of thing that happened all the time. But never in simulations, because simulations assumed equipment worked. The humans watched as the soldiers dealt with it. There was a brief moment of confusion, then adaptation. They switched to visual observation, using their own senses instead of technology. They adjusted their position to get a better vantage point. They divided responsibilities, having different soldiers watch different areas. "They're doing well," Thelnox observed. "Don't jinx it," Hank muttered. Hour 5 brought the bigger problem. The suspected activity turned out to be very real. 3 hostile vessels, small raiders probably, entered the system and began operating near the soldiers' position. The command center erupted in controlled chaos. Multiple voices suggested immediate extraction. Thelnox ordered the support ship to prepare for emergency retrieval. On the ground, the soldiers did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They didn't panic. They assessed the threat, determined the best course of action, and moved. No waiting for orders, no committee discussion. They identified an escape route, covered each other's movement, and began tactical withdrawal. "They're doing exactly what we taught them," Eddie said, something like pride in his voice. Then the situation got worse. The hostile vessels detected something, though it wasn't clear if they'd spotted the soldiers or just noticed anomalous readings. They began an active search pattern. The soldiers adapted again. Instead of running, which would have created movement that sensors could detect, they went to ground. They found cover, minimized their signatures, and waited. Patient, calm, doing the thing that scared them because it was tactically sound. The humans watched tensely as the hostile vessels swept closer to the soldiers' position. "They need to extract now," Thelnox said, reaching for the communication controls. Hank grabbed his hand. "Wait! They're in danger! And they're handling it. Give them credit for their training. Let them do their jobs." The hostile vessels passed within 100 meters of the soldiers' position. Close enough that the soldiers could have hit them with thrown rocks if thrown rocks worked in vacuum. Which they didn't. The soldiers stayed hidden, stayed calm, stayed smart. The vessels moved on, sweeping further into the system, missing the soldiers entirely. After 20 agonizing minutes, the hostiles concluded their sweep and departed the system. The soldiers waited another 30 minutes, making absolutely sure the threat was gone, before moving to the extraction point. The command center was silent as the support ship picked them up and began the journey back to the station. Then Bulldog started laughing. "That's what I'm talking about. They didn't freeze, they didn't panic. They made decisions and survived." The tension broke. Even Thelnox's rigid posture relaxed slightly. "They performed admirably," he said. "Better than I expected." "Better than we expected too," Jimmy admitted. "We were about 50-50 on whether they'd keep their heads under real pressure." "You sent them anyway?" Thelnox asked incredulously. "Had to find out sometime," Hank said with a shrug. "Better to find out on a low-risk reconnaissance mission than during actual combat." When the soldiers returned to the station, they were quiet. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by exhaustion and the shaky relief that came after surviving something genuinely dangerous. The humans met them in the docking bay. "How do you feel?" Eddie asked. The Plenthian soldier who'd asked about hostiles spoke first. "Terrified, exhausted, proud, confused, all of it at once." "Good," Ray said. "That's normal. That's what coming back from a real mission feels like. The fear doesn't go away just because you survived. Sometimes it hits harder after." "We almost ran," another soldier admitted. "When we saw those vessels, every instinct said to just get out of there." "But you didn't," Bulldog pointed out. "You assessed the situation, made a tactical decision, and executed it." "That's exactly right. It didn't feel right," the soldier said. "It felt like hiding while we should have been doing something." "Sometimes hiding is doing something," Hank said. "Sometimes the smart move feels like cowardice, but you're alive. You gathered intelligence, and you completed the mission. That's what matters." Jimmy looked at all 6 soldiers. "You just learned something you can't learn in simulation. You learned that you can handle the real thing, that the training works, that you can make decisions under pressure and survive. That's worth more than 1,000 training exercises." The soldiers dispersed eventually, heading to debriefing and then rest. But they carried with them something new. Confidence, maybe. Or just the knowledge that they'd faced something real and survived it. That went better than I expected, Thelnox said to the humans after the soldiers left. Yeah, Hank agreed. Almost too well. Made me nervous. Why? Because nothing ever goes that smoothly in the real world. We got lucky this time. Next time we might not. I take your point, but surely that proves the training is effective. Eddie shook his head. It proves they can handle a simple, real situation. What happens when the situation's not simple? When the enemy's actively trying to kill them? When they can't just hide and wait? We've taught them to adapt, but adaptation has limits. What are you suggesting? Thelnox asked. I'm suggesting, Jimmy said carefully, that we've done what we can. We've changed how they think, given them tools to survive. But there's only so much you can teach. The rest they have to learn themselves. In situations we can't simulate or control. We can make them better, but we can't make them perfect. Thelnox nodded slowly. The program ends in 1 week. What should we focus on in that final week? The humans looked at each other. The truth, Ray said finally. The final week of training was different from everything that came before. No exercises. No simulations, no tactical drills, just conversation. The humans gathered all the soldiers they'd trained, several hundred by now, in the station's largest assembly area. They sat in a rough circle, the kind of informal arrangement that made military protocol officers twitch. We're leaving in a week, Hank began without preamble. Going back to Earth. Before we go, we need to tell you some things. Things that don't fit in tactical manuals. Things nobody talks about, but everybody needs to know. The assembled soldiers were silent, attentive. First thing, Eddie said, everything we taught you, it's not enough. It'll help. It'll keep you alive longer. But it's not enough, because war's not something you can prepare for, not really. You can train for it, study it, simulate it, but until you're actually in it, until you're making life and death decisions with incomplete information and no time to think, you don't know how you'll react. Some of you will discover you're brave, Jimmy continued. Some will discover you're not as brave as you thought. Some will surprise yourselves. Some will disappoint yourselves. And all of that is normal. There's no shame in being scared. There's no shame in finding out you can't handle it. The only shame is in pretending you're something you're not. Bulldog stood up, pacing slowly. Second thing, the enemy is people. I know that sounds obvious, but it's easy to forget. They're not targets. They're not obstacles. They're people with families and fears and reasons for fighting. That doesn't mean you don't kill them when you have to, but it means you don't enjoy it. You don't dehumanize them. You don't turn them into monsters so you can feel good about killing them. Because if you do that, if you make it easy, you lose something you can't get back. Ray spoke next, his voice quiet but carrying across the space. Third thing, you're gonna lose people. Friends, maybe people you love. It's gonna hurt in ways you can't imagine. And you're going to blame yourselves, wonder if you could have done something different. That's normal too, but you can't let it paralyze you. You grieve, you remember them, and then you keep going, because the people who are still alive need you. Pete stood, his weathered face serious. Fourth thing, when you come back, assuming you do, you're going to be different. Things that used to matter won't. Things you never thought about will keep you up at night. Food will taste different. Jokes won't be funny. You'll find yourself getting angry at stupid things and feeling nothing about things that should matter. That's not weakness. That's what combat does to you. Give yourself time. Talk to people who understand. Don't expect to be who you were before. Hank took over again. Fifth thing, and this is important, your command structure doesn't always know what they're doing. Sometimes they'll give you orders that are stupid. Sometimes they'll make decisions that get people killed for no good reason. Sometimes they'll care more about looking good or following protocol than about your lives. You can't just blindly obey. You need to think. You need to question. You need to be smart enough to know when following orders will get you killed, and brave enough to do something different. The assembly was utterly silent now. But, Jimmy added, you also can't just ignore authority entirely. Sometimes the officers know things you don't. Sometimes the big picture matters more than your individual situation. Sometimes you have to follow orders you don't agree with because that's how military organization works. Knowing when to obey and when to question. That's the hardest part. We can't teach you that. You have to figure it out yourselves. Eddie looked around at all the assembled soldiers. We've been hard on you these past 2 months. We've questioned everything, challenged everything, made you uncomfortable. That was deliberate, because comfortable soldiers are dead soldiers. We needed to shake you out of the assumption that training and reality are the same thing. We needed to teach you to think, not just obey. And I hope we've done that. We're not perfect, Bulldog said with a laugh. Hell, we're pretty far from perfect. We've made mistakes. We've survived things that luck had more to do with than skill. We've got no right to be teaching anybody anything. But we've been there, we've survived, and we wanted to share that, help you survive too. Ray stood again. Last thing, and this is the most important thing. You're gonna ask yourselves, at some point, whether it was worth it. Whether what you did mattered, whether the sacrifice yours and others meant anything, and the answer's complicated. Sometimes it does matter, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you won't know for years, maybe decades, but you can't let that uncertainty destroy you. You did what you thought was right at the time, with the information you had. That's all anyone can do. Hank finished. We're just old soldiers. We survived a war. Came home, tried to make sense of it. Now we're leaving, going back to our quiet lives. But we're leaving you with everything we know, everything we learned. Use it, adapt it, make it your own. And if you survive, if you make it through whatever's coming, pass it on. Teach the next group of scared soldiers how to survive. That's how knowledge continues. That's how we honor the ones who didn't make it. The assembly sat in that for a long time. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just absorbed it, all of it, the truth that nobody had ever told them before. Finally, the Quintarian soldier who'd asked so many questions spoke up. What do we owe you for teaching us all this? Hank smiled. Stay alive. That's what you owe us. Stay alive, keep thinking, and don't become the kind of officer who sends soldiers into danger without understanding the cost. Do that, and we're even. The final days passed quickly. The humans finished last-minute training points, answered final questions, said their goodbyes to soldiers who'd become something more than students. Not friends, exactly, but something harder to define. People who'd shared uncomfortable truths with each other. On the last evening, Thelnox found the humans in their usual spot, the makeshift break room they'd created. They were drinking coffee from the machine Hank had built, playing cards, and arguing about something that had happened 30 years ago. Typical. I wanted to thank you, Thelnox said, interrupting an increasingly heated debate about whether Peterson had actually seen a tiger in the jungle or was just hallucinating from heat exhaustion. Don't thank us yet, Hank said, dealing another hand. We might have completely screwed up your military. Won't know for years. You changed it, certainly. Whether that's good or bad, Thelnox trailed off. Depends on what happens next, Eddie finished. If you face a real threat and they handle it, we're geniuses. If they fall apart, we're the idiots who broke your perfectly good system. There's another possibility, Thelnox said quietly. They might never face a real threat. We might have another 400 years of peace, in which case all this training is theoretical. Would that be so bad? Jimmy asked. I don't know. Is it better to be prepared for something that never comes, or unprepared for something that does? Bulldog laughed. That's the eternal military question right there. You're learning. Thelnox settled into a chair, abandoning formality entirely. Can I ask you something? Personal. Shoot, Hank said. Was it worth it? For you. Vietnam. Everything you went through. Was it worth it? The humans exchanged glances. The question hung in the air like smoke. That's a hell of a question for the last night, Ray said finally. I know, but I need to understand. I'm sending soldiers into potential danger based on your teachings. I need to know if you believe in what you're teaching. Eddie put down his cards. Honest answer, I don't know. Some days I think we prevented something worse. Some days I think we accomplished nothing except getting a lot of people killed. Most days I try not to think about it at all. But you volunteered for this, Thelnox pressed. To teach others. If you don't believe it was worth it... That's not what I said, Eddie interrupted. I said I don't know if the war was worth it. But teaching? Helping people survive? That's different. That has value, whether the war does or not. Jimmy nodded. We can't change the past. Can't make our war mean something it didn't. But we can help other people learn from it. Give them tools to survive. That's worth something. Maybe not worth everything we went through, but something. And honestly, Bulldog added, sitting around feeling sorry for ourselves wasn't accomplishing anything. This, teaching you guys, making a difference, even a small one, that's better than watching daytime television and waiting to die. Pete spoke up, surprising everyone since he'd been quiet most of the evening. You asked if it was worth it. Wrong question. Better question is, what are you gonna do with what you learned? We survived. We got knowledge, paid for in blood and nightmares. Now we've given that knowledge to you. What you do with it, that's what determines if it was worth it. Thelnox absorbed this. No pressure then. Welcome to command, Hank said with a grin. Every decision matters. Nothing's ever certain, and you won't know if you made the right choice until it's too late to change it. Fun, isn't it? Absolutely terrible, Thelnox agreed. I can see why you all turned to coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking terrible coffee and watching the stars through the viewport. 17 humans who'd survived one war and one alien trying to prevent the next one. One more question, Thelnox said eventually. What should I do if, when, we face a real threat? When the shooting actually starts? Ray answered, trust your people. We've given them tools. We've changed how they think. But ultimately, they're going to be the ones making decisions in the moment. You can't control that. You can't predict it. All you can do is trust that the training will hold. And if it doesn't, then you adapt, Hank said simply. Like we've been teaching. The plan fails, you make a new plan. That strategy doesn't work, you try something else. People are going to die, that's unavoidable. But if you taught them to think, to adapt, to survive, some of them will make it. That's the best you can hope for. Thelnox stood. I should let you finish your evening. You have an early departure tomorrow. Commander, Jimmy said, as Thelnox turned to leave. One last piece of advice. Free of charge. Yes? Don't let them forget this. Don't let the next generation of officers smooth over the rough edges. Put the protocols back in place. Return to comfortable tradition. Change is uncomfortable. People will want to undo it. You need to fight that. Keep the chaos. Keep the questioning. Keep the independence. It's messy and difficult and nobody's gonna like it. But it works. I'll try, Thelnox said. That's all any of us can do, Eddie replied. The next morning, transport vessel K-77 prepared for departure. The same ship that had brought the humans to the station 2 months ago, looking considerably more worn now because the humans had borrowed various parts for their coffee maker and other projects. A crowd assembled at the docking bay. Not officially, nobody had organized it, but word had spread and soldiers came. Hundreds of them. The ones who'd been trained directly, and others who'd heard stories, and still others who just wanted to see the humans one last time. They didn't stand at attention, they didn't form ranks, they just gathered watching as 17 old men prepared to leave. Hank looked at the crowd and laughed. Well, that's not regulation. Ah, nothing about this has been regulation, Klexnor said, approaching the group. The major, who'd been so resistant at first, now looked almost sad. That's what made it effective. You're gonna do fine, Major, Bulldog said, clapping him on the shoulder hard enough to make the crystalline being stagger slightly. You learned. You adapted. You stopped being a rigid ass. Well, mostly stopped. You're still kind of an ass. Klexnor's facial tendrils twitched in what might have been amusement. I learned from the best. The humans made their way through the crowd, exchanging words with various soldiers. Handshakes, which was a human gesture that had caught on despite being awkward for species with different appendage configurations. Promises to stay in contact, though everyone knew that was unlikely across interstellar distances. The Quentarian soldier who'd asked so many questions pushed through the crowd. "Consultant Kowalski, one more question." Hank turned, grinning. "Hit me, kid. What's the most important thing you taught us, if you had to pick just one lesson?" Hank considered this, looking at Eddie, Jimmy, Bulldog, Ray, Pete, and the others. They nodded. "The most important thing?" Hank said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "Fear is a liar. It tells you can't. It tells you you're not ready. It tells you to freeze, to wait, to let someone else decide. And sometimes fear is right. But most of the time you can handle it. You are ready enough, and waiting for perfect conditions just means you'll die unprepared. So you feel the fear, acknowledge it, and then you tell it to shut up and move anyway." The crowd was silent. "That's it?" the Quentarian asked. "After 8 weeks, that's the lesson." "That's the lesson," Eddie confirmed. "Everything else was just different ways of teaching that same thing. Move despite the fear. Decide despite the uncertainty. Act despite the risk. That's survival," Jimmy added. "And remember, none of us was special. We weren't heroes. We weren't exceptional soldiers. We were just people who kept moving when everything said to stop. If we could do it, you can too." "Now get out of here," Bulldog said, waving at the crowd. "Go practice. Go question your officers. Go make your commanders uncomfortable. Go be the chaos we taught you to be." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly. The humans boarded the transport vessel, waving from the airlock one last time before it sealed shut. Thelnox watched the ship detach from the station, its engines flaring as it began the long journey back to Earth. He felt something unfamiliar, something his species had evolved past, but apparently could still experience under the right circumstances. Loss. "They were remarkable," Klexnor said, standing beside him. "They were a nightmare," Thelnox corrected. "Disrespectful, undisciplined, contemptuous of authority, and utterly impossible to control." "Yes," Klexnor agreed. "Remarkable." The weeks that followed were interesting. The soldiers trained differently now. Officers found themselves being questioned, not rudely, but persistently. Training exercises became unpredictable as soldiers started deviating from plans, improvising, testing boundaries. The rigid order that had defined Council military operations for centuries began showing cracks. Some commanders hated it. They filed complaints. They demanded a return to proper protocol. They insisted that discipline was breaking down. Other commanders, the ones who'd actually paid attention, encouraged it. They let their soldiers think. They created chaotic training scenarios. They rewarded initiative over obedience. The Council's military began splitting into 2 factions, those who wanted to preserve tradition and those who embraced the new approach. Thelnox found himself caught in the middle, defending decisions that made him deeply uncomfortable, supporting methods that violated everything he'd been taught. It was exhausting. It was also working. 3 months after the humans departed, the Council detected a legitimate threat, not pirates or raiders this time, an actual hostile force, well-armed, well-organized, probing the Council's border defenses. The kind of threat that the Council's 400-year peace had made theoretical. It wasn't theoretical anymore. The Council mobilized response forces, among them several ships crewed by soldiers who'd trained under the humans. Thelnox, now promoted to fleet commander because someone needed to take responsibility for this mess, watched nervously as the forces deployed. The engagement happened quickly. The hostile force attacked a border station, testing the Council's response time and capabilities. It should have been a disaster. The Council's soldiers had never faced real combat, never experienced actual weapons fire, never had to make life-or-death decisions under pressure. But the soldiers who trained with the humans did something unexpected. They adapted. When the plan fell apart immediately, as plans always do, they didn't freeze. When equipment failed, which it did, they improvised. When officers gave contradictory orders, which happened, they made their own decisions. When the situation became chaotic and terrifying, which was inevitable, they kept moving. It wasn't perfect. People made mistakes. Some soldiers panicked. There were casualties, which was unavoidable, but the overall response was functional, messy, unorthodox, nothing like the simulations, but functional. The hostile force, expecting easy targets, found themselves facing opponents who didn't behave predictably, who adapted faster than expected, who made decisions that didn't match tactical projections. The engagement lasted 4 hours. The hostile force withdrew, having achieved none of their objectives and suffering unexpected losses. The Council's forces held. Thelnox received the after-action reports with shaking hands. Multiple officers reported unorthodox tactics. Soldiers had deviated from assigned positions, ignored standard protocols, made independent decisions. It should have been chaos. It had been chaos. But it had worked. One report in particular caught his attention. A young Quentarian soldier, part of the defense force, had apparently organized an improvised ambush using salvaged equipment and creative positioning when her assigned weapon station was destroyed. She'd acted without orders, without authorization, completely contrary to her training. She'd also saved 17 lives. Her name was Quentalis. Thelnox recognized her. She'd been one of the soldiers in the 1st Training Battalion, the one who'd asked Hank for one more question. He pulled up the interview footage from the battle debrief. "Soldier Quentalis, your actions were highly irregular. Can you explain your reasoning?" The soldier looked exhausted, scared, but also defiant. "Sir, the enemy was advancing on our position. The standard response would have been to retreat and request support. But support wasn't coming fast enough, and retreat would have exposed the command center. So I looked at what I had instead of what I should have. I had 3 working rifles, some spare power cells, and 2 soldiers who could shoot. I remembered what Consultant Kowalski said, that the weapon doesn't matter, your brain matters. So we used our brains. You violated protocol." "Yes, sir. The protocol would have gotten people killed. The humans taught us that sometimes you have to choose between following rules and staying alive. I chose staying alive. And if your improvised ambush had failed, then I'd be dead, sir. But at least I'd have tried something instead of just following orders into a meat grinder." The interviewing officer looked uncomfortable. "You understand, this creates problems for the command structure." "Respectfully, sir, I think the command structure's problems are less important than whether we survive. The humans taught us that too." Thelnox watched that footage 3 times. Then he sent a message to Earth. He didn't know if it would reach the humans, didn't know if they'd even care, but he needed to tell them. The message was simple. It worked. They survived because they thought instead of obeyed. We're facing significant resistance from traditional command structures. They want to reinstate the old protocols, eliminate the independence you taught. I'm fighting them. It's difficult, but I wanted you to know it worked. Thank you, and I hope you're enjoying your fishing." He never received a response. The message took weeks to reach Earth, and there was no way to know if it found the right people. The humans had returned to their lives, probably, back to retirement, normalcy, the quiet existence of old soldiers. But 6 weeks later, a package arrived at the station. No return address, no explanation. Just a box addressed to Fleet Commander Thelnox, Council Military Headquarters. Inside was a battered military cap with faded yellow letters reading, "I survived the shit," a bag of coffee beans with a note saying, "Your synthesizer coffee tastes like sadness, try this," and a photograph. The photograph showed 17 old men standing in front of a lake, holding fishing rods, grinning at the camera. On the back, in handwriting that looked like it came from someone who'd forgotten how to write neatly, was a message. "Glad they're thinking. Keep fighting the bureaucrats. Stay chaotic. And remember, fear's a liar. You got this. P.S. The fishing's better on Earth. Thelnox put the photograph on his desk, where it stayed for the rest of his career. A reminder of the time his civilization asked for military advisors and got 17 old men who taught an entire military to question everything. The Council's forces continued evolving. Some commanders embraced the new approach enthusiastically. Others resisted, clinging to tradition and protocol. The debates raged in council chambers and military academies. Philosophers wrote treatises on the balance between discipline and independence. Tactical manuals were rewritten, then rewritten again, then abandoned entirely in favor of principles rather than rules. It was messy, it was controversial. It created division and argument and uncertainty. It also saved lives when the real threats emerged. Because fear was a liar, and waiting for perfect conditions meant dying unprepared. And sometimes the most effective soldiers were the ones who told their commanders that the plan was stupid and did something different instead. The humans never knew the full impact of their 8 weeks on the station, never knew about the philosophical debates they sparked, the military doctrine they revolutionized, the lives saved by soldiers who'd learned to think rather than obey. They were just old men who'd survived a war and wanted to help others survive theirs. They went fishing, drank coffee that actually tasted good, told stories about the time they taught aliens how to make coffee makers from spare parts, and generally lived quiet lives that suggested they'd never left Earth at all. Except sometimes, late at night when the nightmares came, they'd look at the stars and wonder if those soldiers were okay, if the training held, if the chaos they'd created survived the bureaucracy, if anyone remembered that fear was a liar. And on a military station thousands of light years away, a Quentarian soldier looked at a photograph of 17 old men with fishing rods and smiled, remembering the most important lesson. Fear was a liar. You could handle it. You were ready enough. And waiting for permission just meant you'd die unprepared. So you felt the fear, acknowledged it, and told it to shut up. Then you moved anyway. Because that's what the humans taught them in 8 weeks of chaos and coffee and uncomfortable truths. And sometimes, when you're facing impossible odds with incomplete information and no clear answers, that's the only lesson that matters. Years later, the Galactic Council would commission a formal study on the effectiveness of the Human Training Initiative. The study would fill 12 volumes, involve testimony from hundreds of soldiers and commanders, and conclude with the bureaucratically safe assessment that results were mixed and further research is recommended. But buried in Volume 8, in a footnote that almost nobody read, was a single statistic: survival rates for soldiers who'd trained under the humans versus those who hadn't during combat situations. The difference was 43%. 43% more soldiers came home because 17 old men had taught them that following the manual was a great way to die, that improvisation beat perfection, that fear was a liar, and that sometimes you had to tell your commanding officer that their plan was stupid and you were doing something else instead. The Council never sent another request for military advisors to Earth. They didn't need to. The lesson had been learned, passed down, adapted, changed, and integrated into a new generation of soldiers who knew that survival mattered more than protocol. Somewhere on Earth, in a small town nobody's heard of, an old man sat by a lake with a fishing rod and terrible coffee, watching the sunset and remembering a time when aliens asked for help and got exactly what they needed, even if it wasn't what they wanted. He didn't know about the 43%, didn't know about the lives